The main hall of forward operating base Arcturus carried the particular smell of victory mixed with exhaustion. Recycled air, synthetic protein heating in dispensers, and that distinctive combination of sweat and relief that only soldiers who'd survived something terrible could produce. Through the reinforced viewports, Vardo 7's ravaged surface stretched out in a patchwork of blast craters and hastily erected force barriers still glowing faintly in the dusk of an alien world. 3 months. 3 months of fighting the Krill arm in tunnels that twisted through this moon's crust like a parasite's burrow system. And somehow impossibly, they'd won. Princess Lyra Thorne's hands rested on the final casualty report, fingers tracing the numbers without seeing them anymore. She'd memorized these statistics hours ago. Sector 12, 43 days of continuous engagement. 847 soldiers had entered those collapsed mining tunnels. 614 had walked out. 0 tactical errors. Maximum survival rate achievable given the circumstances. The analysis was clean, professional, irrefutable. Lieutenant Kesavaren's name appeared on page 7, line 38. Plasma blast direct hit day 38 of the operation. The report didn't mention that the blast had been meant for Lyra. It didn't mention the last words Kessa had whispered as her blue skin faded to gray. It didn't mention that Lyra had held her friend's hand until it went cold, then stood up and led the final assault that broke the Krill defensive line. Reports never mentioned the things that mattered. Lyra signed her name at the bottom with the practiced precision of royalty, the neural implant behind her right ear pulsing softly as it transmitted her authorization codes. The document sealed itself classified, filed, forgotten by everyone except those who carried the weight of what those numbers actually meant. She arrived at the celebration early. This was habitual, ingrained through years of training that preceded her military service by decades. Warriors assessed before engaging. Diplomats observed before participating. Royalty never entered a room without understanding every element within it. The mess hall was empty, cleaned and prepared for the evening's festivities. Lyra's boots made no sound on the polished floor as she moved through the space ice cataloging entrances, exits, sight lines, potential threats. A trick she'd mastered years ago, useful for both ceremonial occasions and cutting throats in the dark. The line between the two had blurred considerably over the past 3 months. The plasma burns on her left arm had healed to faint silver lines against her blue skin, testament to a close call with a Krill energy weapon during the final push through Sector 7's collapsed eastern shaft. Medical had offered cosmetic regeneration. She'd refused. Scars were honest. They told the truth when words could not. She chose her table with the same tactical precision she applied to everything. Back to the viewport where no one could approach unseen. Good sight lines to all 3 entrances. Proximity to the emergency exit if this celebration became as tedious as she expected. The view through the reinforced glass was exceptional stars, brilliant against the void Vardo 7's parent planet rising in a pale crescent over the ravaged horizon. Someone might see that view and choose this table for its beauty. Someone might. But they wouldn't. The chair felt solid beneath her as she settled in her golden hair, braided in the traditional warrior style that marked her as blooded royalty, the intricate pattern falling over one shoulder. Her ears, longer and more elegantly tapered than human ears, picked up the first sounds of approaching soldiers from 3 corridors away. Voices raised in that particular way humans laughed when they'd been scared and were trying to convince themselves they hadn't been. The celebration was beginning. She had time. The neural implant pulsed again, updating her on fleet movements in diplomatic communiques that never stopped even during celebrations meant to honor rest. She dismissed them with a thought. Tonight was supposed to be about victory, about pretending that warriors were people who could sit together and share meals instead of counting their dead and preparing for the next deployment. The first wave of soldiers entered in clusters, voices already raised in conversation that felt forced performative. Humans laughed louder than Xylanthians, she'd noticed. As if volume could convince the universe they were fine. Everything was fine. They definitely hadn't spent 3 months wondering if each day would be their last. She watched them scatter to tables with the randomness of water finding its level. Conversations flowing, trays clattering, someone dropping a fork, and 6 people making the same joke about Butterfingers. Normal. Easy. The kind of casual camaraderie that happened when rank temporarily dissolved in the shared experience of survival. And then she became aware of the perimeter forming around her table. It happened gradually, inevitably, like watching ice crystallize on water. The nearest occupied table settled at exactly 4.7 meters from her position. She'd measured it without meaning to, the way her tactical training measured everything. 4.7 meters, the distance of respect, or fear, or whatever combination of the two had calcified around her over the years until even her own people approached her the way one might approach an armed explosive device. A Zalanthian lieutenant she recognized from the 3rd Atmospheric Brigade made eye contact across the hall, raised his glass in silent salute, then deliberately chose a seat at the opposite end of the room. Professional courtesy, appropriate distance. She returned the gesture with a slight inclination of her head that acknowledged his respect while confirming the invisible barrier between them. More soldiers flooded in. The hall had been designed to hold 300. It looked like at least 400 had crammed themselves inside, sitting on tables, standing against walls, determined to celebrate being alive with the intensity of people who'd accepted they were going to and somehow hadn't. The noise level rose to something that would have been painful if her species-enhanced hearing didn't come with automatic dampening reflexes. Somewhere near the far wall, a human was teaching a group of Zalanthians something called a drinking song, which appeared to involve rhythmic shouting and questionable rhymes about a woman from Nantucket. The empty chairs around her became more obvious as the hall filled. She watched a young human private approach with his tray, eyes fixed on the chair directly across from her. His path was direct, intentional. For a moment, she wondered if this one might actually sit down. If perhaps the newest soldiers, the ones who hadn't heard all the stories yet, might still see empty chairs instead of forbidden territory. His squad mate grabbed his shoulder and physically steered him toward a different table with a shake of his head that clearly communicated danger. The private glanced back, once confused, then shrugged and joined the safer crowd. Lyra's hand hesitated over her meal. The food synthesizers claimed this was Zalanthian grain stew, but the synthesizers were lying. She could taste the lie in every spoonful. She forced herself to take a bite anyway. Chew, swallow. Pretend this was fine. Pretend she'd chosen this isolation, rather than having it chosen for her by 7 honored duels, each one technically justified, each one adding another layer to her reputation as untouchable. The Ice Princess. She'd heard the whispers even through the dampening reflexes. Her ears caught sounds humans couldn't imagine, picked up conversations from across crowded rooms, detected the subtle shift in tone when people spoke about her versus to her. The princess who'd broken Lieutenant Korvax's arm in 3 places for touching her shoulder without permission during a briefing 10 months ago. Who challenged Commander Thexus to single combat for presuming to offer tactical advice in front of junior officers. Who'd coldly informed Captain Ashford that his attempt at friendly conversation was noted and unwelcome with such precision that the man still walked carefully around all Xylanthian royalty 6 months later. They weren't wrong. She had done those things. The rules of military protocol regarding royal blood were clear, and she'd enforce them because enforcement was easier than explaining. Easier than admitting that sometimes she wanted someone to touch her shoulder, to offer advice, to make conversation like she was a person, instead of a tactical asset wearing a crown. Laughter erupted from a table near the viewport. Humans and Xylanthians mixed together, someone telling a story with wild hand gestures, while others leaned in grinning. One of the Xylanthian soldiers caught her looking and immediately straightened, the smile fading from his face until she deliberately turned her attention back to her stew. The conversation resumed behind her, more quietly now, the joy slightly dampened by her proximity. Her ears twitched involuntarily, a tell she'd never quite managed to suppress when she was uncomfortable. An old Xylanthian instinct predator senses reading the environment. And right now, the environment was telling her that she'd become the social equivalent of a singularity, a point of gravity that nothing could escape but nothing wanted to approach. The stew tasted like recycled protein paste wearing an unconvincing disguise. She took another bite anyway. Mechanical, necessary. Warriors ate not because they were hungry, but because their bodies required fuel. Through the viewport, Vardo 7's sunset painted the blast craters in shades of amber and shadow. Beautiful in the way that battlefields could be beautiful when the fighting stopped and you were still alive to see them. She tried to remember when exactly sitting alone had stopped being a choice and started being a sentence she couldn't appeal. 10 months ago, Lieutenant Korvax had touched her shoulder during a tactical briefing. Just a casual gesture, the kind of thing soldiers did to emphasize a point or offer reassurance. His hand had landed on her shoulder without warning, without permission, and every Xylanthian officer in the room had gone silent. The touch itself hadn't hurt, but touch was intimacy. Intimacy required consent. And rank title shared service, none of that granted access to royalty without explicit permission. She'd issued the formal challenge before she'd consciously decided to. The words had come automatically trained into her since childhood. Commander Korvax, you have breached protocol. I challenge you to answer for it. The duel had been fair witness conducted according to military regulations. She'd broken his arm in 3 places. Clean breaks easily treated no permanent damage. He'd accepted the outcome with grace, apologized for his presumption, returned to duty after medical clearance, and never came within 3 meters of her again. 9 months ago, Ensign Bradshaw had questioned her tactical decision during a squad briefing. Nothing aggressive, just a simple question about alternative approaches to the Sector 12 assault. Reasonable question, intelligent question, asked in front of 20 junior officers who needed to believe their commanders were infallible. Undermining command in public even unintentionally undermined the entire structure. She couldn't allow that. The challenge had been issued. The duel had lasted less than a minute. 8 months ago, Commander Thexus. 6 months ago, Major Williams. 5 months ago, Lieutenant Graves. 4 months ago, Captain Reeves. 7 duels in 10 months. 7 walls built between her and everyone else. Each one justified by protocol. Each one necessary to maintain order, discipline, respect for rank and tradition. Each one absolutely correct according to the regulations that govern Xylanthian military nobility. Each one isolating her further. The worst part was knowing she'd done this to herself. The protocols existed, yes, but enforcement was discretionary. She could have let the shoulder touch pass with a verbal warning, could have answered Bradshaw's question instead of challenging him, could have chosen mercy over correctness 7 times. But then Sector 12 had happened. Day 38. The Krill plasma bombardment that should have killed her, but it killed Kessa Veyron instead. Kessa, who'd served as her tactical advisor for 2 years. Who'd become something more than an advisor, something closer to a friend. Who'd seen the shot aimed at Lyra's position and pushed her aside without hesitation, without thought for her own safety. Lyra had held her as she died. Kessa's blue skin fading to gray, her breathing becoming shallow-labored. And in those final moments, Kessa had used her last breath not for herself but for Lyra. "Stop hiding behind your crown," she'd whispered. "They need to see you bleed too." Then her eyes had closed and Lyra had been alone. She'd stood up, wiped the blood from her hands, led the final assault that broke the Krill defensive line and secured Sector 12. 23 Krill had died by her blade that day. She'd counted each one. Methodical, precise, necessary. She had not cried. Warriors didn't cry. Princesses didn't cry. Leaders couldn't afford to cry because crying meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness meant it losing more soldiers like Kessa. So she'd enforced protocol instead. Built walls instead of bridges. Chosen isolation because isolation was safer than risking another loss like that. 7 duels, 7 walls. Kessa had been right. But Kessa was gone and the walls remained. Lyra stared at her synthetic stew and wondered if this was what victory was supposed to feel like. If surviving was supposed to taste this much like loneliness. The hall's noise level stabilized conversations flowing around her like water around a stone. She was part of the celebration in location only. Present but not participating. Visible but untouchable. She took another bite of the terrible stew. Chewed, swallowed, watched the stars through the viewport and tried to convince herself this was enough. Then Corporal Declan Thorne pushed through the entrance, 20 minutes late, still wearing his tactical vest because the clasps had fused during some firefight, and he couldn't get the damn thing off without bolt cutters, and he was laughing. Not polite celebration laughter. Real laughter. The kind that came from exhaustion and relief mixing into something almost hysterical. His jaw showed the telltale shimmer of a regeneration patch still knitting together flesh that had been carved away by Krill energy weapons. The patch covered nearly a quarter of his face, giving him a lopsided appearance that should have looked grotesque, but somehow just looked alive. He was laughing so hard, he had to pause in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, completely oblivious to the fact that his entrance had drawn attention from half the hall. Lyra's enhanced hearing picked up his voice clearly, despite the ambient noise. He was talking to someone behind him, another human soldier, words tumbling out between gasps of laughter. Aggressive, defensive positioning. He actually said that Patterson got pinned behind a cargo container for 2 hours and called it aggressive defensive positioning. The other soldier, the one Lyra vaguely recognized as Rico, something tried to shush him, but Declan was beyond caring. 3 months of fear and combat had apparently broken whatever filter normally existed between his brain and his mouth. The man wouldn't know tactics if they shot him in the face, which they almost did multiple times. More laughter, the kind that hurt ribs and made breathing difficult. Lyra found herself watching him, not assessing him as a threat, not cataloging his rank or unit designation, just watching someone experience genuine joy after surviving hell. When had she last laughed like that? Declan pushed away from the doorframe and made his way toward the food dispensers, still chuckling to himself. His movements had the particular looseness of extreme fatigue, that point where the body ran on pure momentum because conscious control required too much energy. He grabbed a tray, loaded it with what the dispensers optimistically labeled as meatloaf and vegetables, then turned to scan the hall for seating. Lyra watched his eyes move across the crowded space. Watched them skip over the packed tables, the standing groups, the soldiers sitting on floors, because there weren't enough chairs. Watched them land on her table. 6 empty chairs. Perfect view of the stars. One occupant who clearly wasn't saving the seats for anyone. Basic mathematics suggested those chairs were available. Declan's exhausted brain apparently agreed with that assessment because he started walking toward her table without hesitation, without the careful distance everyone else maintained, without any indication that he recognized who she was or what those empty chairs actually represented. Lyra's hand froze halfway to her mouth, spoons suspended in air. He was going to sit down. This human soldier with the regenerating jaw and the tactical vest he couldn't remove, and the laughter still dancing in his eyes, was actually going to sit down at her table. She could stop him. 2 words would do it. A gesture. A look. The Ice Princess could freeze him out before he even pulled out a chair. But he was still smiling. Whatever had made him laugh in the hallway was still warming him from the inside out. And Lyra realized with sudden clarity that she wanted to know what had caused that laughter. She wanted to know what joy sounded like when it was real instead of performative. "Mind if I sit?" Declan asked, but he was already dropping into the chair across from her, already setting his tray down with a clatter that seemed too loud in the sudden pocket of silence that formed around their table. 6 empty chairs, one occupied. Basic math suggested she wasn't holding them for anyone. He attacked his meatloaf, immediately too hungry or too tired to notice that every conversation within 10 meters had stopped. Too focused on food to see that 200 soldiers were now staring directly at him, with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. Lyra watched the silence spread like ripples in water. Watched tables go quiet in waves, the effect radiating outward from their position. Watched Captain Vex freeze with his drink, halfway raised. Watched human lieutenants exchange glances that clearly communicated what the hell is he doing. Watched Rico stand paralyzed near the entrance, with the expression of someone who just witnessed his friend juggle live grenades. Declan looked up from his food, finally noticing the silence. His eyes moved across the staring faces, confusion replacing the residual laughter. "What?" he said to the hall at large. "Do I have something on my face besides this region patch? Because yeah, I know Krill tried to redesign my jawline. Very exciting, we all have stories." He touched the regeneration patch self-consciously, then looked at Lyra with that same confused expression, as if she might explain why everyone was acting strange. She found herself studying him for the first time, really looking at him instead of simply registering his presence. Human. Pale skin beneath his grime and exhaustion. Golden brown hair matted with sweat. Eyes that were green or maybe gray, difficult to tell in the artificial lighting. Military insignia on his vest that her brain was too surprised to decode properly. And that regeneration patch covering nearly a quarter of his jaw, evidence of damage that should have killed him, but hadn't. "Wow," he said, turning back to her with that casual tone of someone too tired to remember proper social filters. "Tough crowd tonight, huh? You'd think they'd never seen someone sit down before. He took another bite of meatloaf, grimacing at the taste, but eating it anyway because soldiers ate what was available. Is this like a weird human Xylanthian thing I don't know about? Because I sat through all the cultural sensitivity briefings, but I'll be honest, I fell asleep during most of them. 3 months eating protein paste kind of destroys your ability to focus on anything that isn't food or sleep. Lyra stared at him, just stared, because this human soldier had done what no one else had done in 10 months. He'd sat down at her table without fear, without calculation, without any apparent awareness that he'd just violated a dozen unspoken rules about approaching Xylanthian royalty. He'd seen empty chairs and a good view, and made a simple decision based on practical considerations. When had anyone last made anything simple around her? What was funny, she heard herself ask. The question came out before she'd consciously decided to speak. But once asked, she found she genuinely wanted to know, needed to know. What made a soldier laugh like that after 3 months of hell? Declan blinked at her, surprised by the question. Surprised that she was engaging with him at all. What was funny, she repeated. When you entered, you were laughing. What was funny? It was such an unexpected question, such a departure from the cold distance everyone expected from the Ice Princess that Declan found himself answering automatically, his natural storytelling instincts, overriding whatever exhausted judgment he had left. Oh, Commander Patterson's speech, my buddy Rico was just telling me. He paused, glancing around as if suddenly remembering they had an audience, then apparently decided he was too tired to care. Okay, so you know how Patterson does that thing where he pauses dramatically in the middle of sentences? He demonstrated puffing his chest out and adopting what he clearly hoped was a reasonable impression of their commander's self-important tone. We must proceed with utmost consideration toward the achievement of tactical objectives. He caught himself mid-gesture, suddenly aware that he was doing a comedy routine in front of someone whose rank insignia he still couldn't quite identify, while approximately 200 soldiers watched in dead silence. But having started, he committed to the bit. That was Declan Thorne. Once the joke train left the station, it was reaching its destination, regardless of obstacles. Anyway, Rico pointed out that Patterson spent the entire final assault pinned behind a cargo container, calling for backup. But in his speech tonight, he described it as aggressive defensive positioning, which is possibly the most Patterson thing I've ever heard. The corner of Lyra's mouth twitched, just barely, almost invisible. But Declan had spent enough time playing poker during downtime to recognize micro-expressions. He'd seen it, a smile, or the ghost of one. That's a diplomatic way of saying the man wouldn't know tactics if they shot him in the face, she said. And there was something in her tone, something dry and understated, that made Declan grin despite his exhaustion. Which they almost did, multiple times, he agreed, warming to the conversation now. Patterson has a unique relationship with accurate tactical assessment. He took another bite of the maybe meatloaf, grimacing. This food is terrible. Please tell me your people have better synthesizers, because if this is what victory tastes like, I'm not sure it was worth 3 months of eating protein paste. Across the hall, Captain Vex had partially risen from his seat, looking torn between intervention and self-preservation. Several human soldiers were whispering urgently, heads close together. Someone dropped a glass, and the sound shattered through the silence like gunfire. But Declan registered all of this peripherally, the way you register background noise when focused on something else. Right now, he was focused on the fact that this Xylanthian woman, whoever she was, had asked him what was funny, like it was a genuine question rather than small talk. And that felt significant in a way his tired brain couldn't quite articulate. You were in the Northern Hemisphere operation, right? He asked, pointing at a commendation on her uniform that he recognized from the briefings he hadn't slept through. Sector 12, that was a nightmare. We heard you guys were fighting in collapsed mine systems with zero visibility and krill coming through the walls. Lyra found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to engage with the question. Sector 12 was worse than the report suggested, she heard herself say. The krill had tunneled through the eastern mining complex and turned the entire structure into a warren. We couldn't use heavy weapons without collapsing what remained of the support systems. So you fought them in the dark with knives and bad attitudes, Declan said. And it wasn't a question. He was already nodding like this made perfect sense, which it did, but nobody ever seemed to understand that, without needing extensive explanation. We had something similar in Sector 7, he continued, except our tunnels kept flooding with coolant runoff from the damaged reactors. We were fighting waist-deep in toxic sludge that ate through our boots. Jenkins lost 3 pairs before he just started wrapping his feet in plastic sheeting and hoping for the best. Did it work? Lyra asked, and felt something strange happening to her face. Her cheek muscles were moving in unfamiliar ways. Upward, a smile, an actual smile. Absolutely not, Declan said, grinning. He got chemical burns on both feet and spent 2 days in medical bay explaining to very unsympathetic doctors why he'd chosen plastic sheeting over, quote, literally any other option. But he survived, which is more than the Krill did, so I guess his tactical thinking was just as good as Patterson's aggressive defensive positioning. The laugh that escaped Lyra's throat surprised her more than it surprised anyone else, though the ripple of shock that went through the nearest tables suggested she wasn't alone in her surprise. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed at anything. Months, maybe longer. Laughter required a certain lowering of defenses that her position rarely allowed. But here now, with this exhausted human soldier who'd sat down at her table because he saw empty chairs instead of barriers, she laughed. And the sound felt like breaking glass, like something shattering that had been holding her together for too long. Declan didn't seem to notice the minor seismic event his joke had triggered. He was attacking his meal with the dedication of someone who'd been living on emergency rations, pausing between bites to gesture with his fork in a way that would have horrified any etiquette instructor. The worst part about the whole operation, he said through a mouthful of vegetables, was being trapped in that collapsed tunnel for 2 days. Half the squad, no communication with command, and Jenkins insisting he could find a bathroom somewhere in the rubble. He swallowed, took a drink of water. Like Buddy, we're sealed in by 3 tons of rock and an active krill nest. Your bathroom priorities are noted, but maybe not realistic right now. What did you do? Lyra found herself leaning forward slightly, her abandoned stew forgotten. Majority vote, Declan said solemnly. We told him to pick a corner and we'd all look away. Democracy in action. He finally succeeded in choking down a bite of the vegetables and immediately reached for his water again. Although there was this moment when we thought we heard krill movement on the other side of the collapse, and Jenkins was convinced they could hear him. So he just froze mid-situation for like 10 minutes until we confirmed it was just settling rubble. My buddy Rico still won't let him forget it. Lyra's ears twitched with amusement, and she saw Declan's eyes track the movement with curiosity rather than the usual discomfort humans showed around Zalanthian physiology. Your hearing must have been useful for that kind of close-quarters fighting, he said matter-of-fact. Being able to track krill through walls and around corners. Though I'm guessing the artillery bombardments were absolute hell for you. We had standard human ears, and even we couldn't hear right for days after the heavy guns started. Nobody asked about her ears. People either pretended they were normal or stared at them like they were alien artifacts, which technically they were. But the point stood. Declan had just acknowledged them as a tactical advantage and a liability in the same breath. The way you might discuss any other piece of military equipment. Natural, practical, without the weight of otherness that usually accompanied observations about Zylanthian physiology. The bombardments were challenging, Lyra admitted, which was a dramatic understatement for the experience of having enhanced hearing during sustained artillery fire. We have internal dampening reflexes, but they're designed for natural environmental noise, not human heavy weapons. The first barrage in Sector 12 caused temporary disorientation for most of my unit. That's a nice way of saying you all wanted to die, Declan said sympathetically. Yeah, I can't imagine. We had one guy, Torres, who had experimental audio enhancers installed before deployment. Military thought it would be great for reconnaissance. Lasted exactly 1 firefight before he ripped them out himself with a combat knife and threw them at a krill. Pretty sure that's not standard uninstallation procedure, but nobody questioned his methodology. A Zalanthian captain at the next table was openly staring. Now his expression cycling through confusion, concern, and something that might have been hope. Lyra caught his eye and he immediately looked away, but not before she saw the question written across his face. She didn't have an answer for him. She didn't have answers for herself. All she knew was that for the first time in 10 months, someone was talking to her like she was a soldier instead of a symbol, and she didn't want it to stop. So how long were you in Sector 12? Declan asked, completely oblivious to or unconcerned with the fact that every conversation in their immediate vicinity had stopped, and everyone was now listening to them with the intensity of people eavesdropping on something they couldn't quite believe was happening. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly around her spoon. The answer sat in her throat like broken glass. 43 days. 43 days that had stretched into something beyond time, beyond endurance, into a space where darkness and violence and exhaustion blurred together until she couldn't remember what sunlight looked like. 43 days continuous engagement with minimal resupply, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. Professional, the way she delivered the information in a dozen debriefings and tactical reviews. We lost the surface positions on day 12 and had to hold the lower levels while command organized the counteroffensive. The words came out easier than they should have. She didn't talk about Sector 12. She filed reports about Sector 12, received commendations for Sector 12, woke up at night still smelling the recycled air of those tunnels, still hearing the skittering sound of krill, moving through ventilation shafts, still feeling Kessa's hand going cold in hers. But she didn't talk about it. 43 days in the dark fighting krill hand to hand, Declan said quietly, and for the first time since he'd sat down, his casual demeanor shifted into something more serious, something that recognized the weight of what she'd just shared. That's beyond rough. We thought 2 days was bad. I can't imagine 6 weeks. You think about it differently after the first week. Lyra heard herself say, words coming from someplace deeper than conscious thought. It stops being about duration and starts being about the next engagement, the next hour, the next breath. Time loses meaning when you can't see the sun. Declan nodded slowly and she realized he understood exactly what she meant. He'd been there too. Maybe not for as long, maybe not in the exact same hell, but close enough that he recognized the topology of that particular nightmare. Well, he said, finally pushing his tray of mostly eaten, terrible food aside, at least the food's terrible for everyone. Equal opportunity disappointment. He reached into one of the many pockets on his fused tactical vest and produced a wrapped ration bar, the kind they handed out during deployment when even the protein paste ran low. Emergency dessert barely sweet enough to qualify as a treat, but infinitely better than anything the synthesizers produced. Speaking of which, he said, breaking the bar in half without waiting for any kind of response, I saved my dessert ration for later. You want half? Everyone deserves something sweet after the week we've had, month, whatever. Time is fake. He slid one piece across the table toward her, the gesture so simple and thoughtlessly generous that Lyra felt something crack in her chest. Around them, she could feel the weight of attention, the held breath of soldiers waiting to see what she'd do with this casual offering from a human who still hadn't figured out who she was. Captain Vex had leaned forward slightly, ready to intervene if she gave any sign of offense. The human soldiers at nearby tables wore expressions ranging from horrified fascination to barely suppressed amusement. And Declan just sat there already unwrapping his half of the ration bar, completely unaware that he'd just done something nobody else had dared to do in 10 months. He'd offered her something with no calculation behind it, no attempt to curry favor, no awareness of protocol or rank, or the vast social distance that was supposed to exist between a Xylanthian princess and a human corporal. Just simple generosity because he thought she might want something sweet after surviving hell. Lyra reached out and took the half-ration bar, her blue fingers brushing against the synthetic wrapper. The texture was familiar from 100 deployments, 1,000 meals eaten in the field when proper food wasn't available. Thank you, she said quietly, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with synthetic chocolate. The conversation continued in defiance of every social law that governed the space around Princess Lyra Thorne. Declan told her about the time his entire platoon got stuck in a malfunctioning cargo transport with a Xylanthian logistics officer who'd spent 6 hours lecturing them about proper equipment, requisition procedures, while they slowly asphyxiated. The punchline involved someone finally getting the emergency override to work, only to discover they'd been parked next to the correct hangar the entire time, but nobody had thought to check the external monitors. She told him about the junior lieutenant who'd accidentally set off a plasma grenade inside his own barracks during a training exercise and tried to blame it on krill infiltration, despite being stationed on a base 4 light-years from any active combat zone. They traded stories like currency, each one slightly more absurd than the last. And somewhere in the exchange, Lyra realized she was smiling openly. Not the careful diplomatic expression she'd perfected over years of state functions and military ceremonies. Something genuine and unguarded. Something she'd thought Sector 12 had killed along with Kessa. The hall had settled into a new equilibrium. Conversation resuming at other tables, but with a different quality now. Like everyone was pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. Trying to act normal while witnessing something that felt historic in its abnormality. Rico had finally moved from his paralyzed position near the entrance and taken a seat at a table 10 meters away. But he kept glancing over with the expression of someone witnessing a statistical impossibility. His companions kept asking him questions in urgent whispers, and he kept shaking his head like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing either. Several Xylanthian officers were having what appeared to be an urgent whispered debate. Captain Vex, she noticed, was at the center of it. His eyes kept flicking between her and Declan, his expression cycling through concern and something that looked almost like hope. Vex had served under her command in Sector 12. He'd been there for 37 of those 43 days before taking shrapnel to the leg and being evacuated to medical. He knew what those tunnels had been like, knew what she'd lost, and he'd never seen her smile not once in all the months since. But he was seeing it now. "So how long were you trapped?" Lyra asked, realizing she wanted to know more about Declan's experience. Wanted to understand what had shaped this soldier who could walk through her walls like they were made of fog. 2 days, Declan said, and his voice dropped slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that she heard the weight beneath the words. "Half the squad. No comms with command. We thought we'd die there." He paused, took a drink of water. "Heard Krill digging toward us. Counted the hours. Private Gallagher kept time by singing Irish songs. Figured if we were going to dope, at least we'd die annoyed by his terrible voice." "What did you do?" Lyra asked, leaning forward. "Dug with our hands till they bled," Declan said simply. "Took turns. 16 hours of digging through collapsed rock and krill corpses and structural debris. Gallagher never stopped singing. Drove us crazy, but it kept us focused. Gave us rhythm to work to." His expression shifted into something harder. "He stepped on a mine 2 weeks later. Saved the whole squad. Saw it before anyone else threw himself on it. Just reflex, I guess. Training, heroism. Whatever you want to call it when someone decides their life is worth less than 6 other lives combined." Lyra was quiet for a moment. She understood that particular math. The calculus of sacrifice that every commander learned eventually. The weight of being the one who survived when others didn't. "Sector 12, Day 22. She said, her voice matching his tone. "Level. Controlled. Carrying weight without breaking under it. Krill breached our defensive line. Cut us off from surface support for 11 days. No resupply. Recycled air that turned toxic after day 7. We rationed water so strictly that some soldiers went delirious." "But you held," Declan said. "Not a question." "We held," Lyra confirmed, "because retreat meant losing the moon. Meant the Krill would have a staging point for attacks on colonial holdings. Meant more soldiers dying in operations that could have been prevented. So we held." "After the first week," Declan said quietly, "you stop counting days. You just count breaths." "Yes, it," Lyra said, and felt something loosen in her chest. "Exactly that. Just breathes." They sat in shared silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable. The opposite. The silence of people who spoke the same language fluently. Who'd seen the same darkness and come out the other side, carrying it differently, but carrying it nonetheless. Around them, the hall continued its celebration. But in their small pocket of space, something deeper was happening. Recognition. The kind that only came from shared experience of things that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. "I lost my tactical advisor," Lyra heard herself say, and the words surprised her. She hadn't planned to share this, hadn't talked about Kessa with anyone except in official reports. "Lieutenant Kessa Veyron, Day 38. Plasma blast." She paused, made herself say it. "Meant for me." She pushed me aside. Declan's expression shifted. Not to pity. She would have hated pity, but to understanding. to the recognition of loss that every soldier who'd survived long enough carried like scar tissue. "I'm sorry," he said, and left it at that. No platitudes about how she died a hero. No assurances that it wasn't Lyra's fault. Just acknowledgement that loss had happened and there was no making it okay. "She told me to stop hiding," Lyra said, and realized she was testing something, saying out loud the thing that had been echoing in her head for 5 weeks. Her last word, she said I was hiding behind my crown, that my soldiers needed to see me bleed too. "She was right," Declan said. Then before Lyra could react to that, he added, "Gallagher told me something similar. Said I use jokes to avoid feeling scared. That someday I'd need to let myself be scared instead of deflecting it." He shrugged. "I didn't listen. Still don't mostly. It's easier to laugh than to admit that I spent 2 days convinced I'd die in the dark and nobody would even know where to find the body." "You use humor as armor," Lyra said, understanding clicking into place. "You use protocol," Declan said, meeting her eyes. The moment stretched between them. Recognition of parallel defenses, different methods, same purpose. Keep the world at distance so it couldn't hurt as much when pieces of it died in your arms. "Yes," Lyra said finally. "I do." Captain Vex made a decision. She saw it happen, saw him straighten in his chair, exchange a look with the officers he'd been debating with, then stand. Not aggressive, careful, testing. He approached their table with deliberate steps, giving Lyra time to stop him if she wanted to maintain the status quo. She didn't stop him. "Your Highness," he said, standing at attention until she gestured for him to relax. "Permission to join you." It was the first time in 10 months anyone had asked that question. The first time since she'd started building walls that someone had tested whether those walls still existed or if they'd just been breached beyond repair. Lyra looked at the empty chairs, 4 of them still available. Looked at Declan, who was watching this exchange with interest, but no jealousy, no possessiveness over the space he'd claimed. Looked at Vex, who'd served under her command in the worst conditions imaginable and had earned the right to ask. This was a choice, a deliberate one. She could say no, maintain the boundary, keep the walls intact even if one person had managed to slip through. Or she could choose differently. Kessa's voice echoed in her memory. "Stop hiding behind your crown." "Granted," Lyra said, and felt the weight of the decision even as she made it. "Sit, Captain. Tell Corporal Thorne about Sector 12 from your perspective. I'm curious to hear how our experiences aligned." Vex's face registered surprise, then something that might have been joy before he schooled it back into professional neutrality. He pulled out a chair, sat down with the careful movements of someone still not quite believing this was happening. "Corporal Thorne," he said, extending a hand across the table. "Captain Vex, I commanded 3rd Platoon under Her Highness during the Sector 12 operation." Declan shook his hand, grinning. "Declan, I'd say it's nice to meet you, but honestly, anyone who survived Sector 12 has my automatic respect. That operation was a nightmare from every angle." "The reports barely captured a fraction of it," Vex said, and then he was talking, sharing details that hadn't made it into official documentation. The way the tunnels had felt like they were closing in. The sound of krill moving through ventilation shafts overhead. The moment when they'd lost contact with Surface Command and had to make decisions based on incomplete information and gut instinct. And Lyra listened, participated, added her own observations when relevant, let herself be part of a conversation instead of directing it from isolated authority. She watched it happen in real time. The shift from formal military hierarchy to something more fluid, more human. Vex started the conversation addressing her as Your Highness, but as the stories flowed and the shared experiences built connection, it shifted to Commander. Then just Ma'am. Then once he forgot himself entirely and said Lyra before catching himself and apologizing. She didn't correct him, didn't enforce the boundary, just continued the conversation like the lapse hadn't happened and watched relief flood his expression. 2 more Xylanthian officers approached, hesitant, testing. They stopped a respectful distance away, waiting for acknowledgement. Lyra looked up at them, Lieutenant Marcellus, who'd led the Western Tunnel defense, Ensign Kane, who'd coordinated supply distribution during the siege. Both solid officers. Both had served well. "Gentlemen," she said, "there are chairs available if you'd like to join us." They sat, carefully, like they were defusing bombs. But they sat. The table filled slowly, each addition feeling like testing weight on ice that might crack at any moment. But it didn't crack. Rico finally worked up the courage to approach Trey in hand expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "Room for one more?" he asked, and there was genuine question in his voice, not presumption. "I promise to behave, mostly. No guarantees." Declan grinned at him. "Rico, get over here. You need to hear Captain Vex's story about the time they had to navigate the eastern tunnels using echolocation because all their equipment got fried by krill electromagnetic pulses." Rico sat and the table was full now. 8 people, mixed human and Xylanthian, mixed ranks, all of them talking, sharing stories, trading experiences from different sectors and different hells that somehow added up to the same war. And Lyra sat at the center of it, not isolated, not untouchable, present, participating, herself. The conversation flowed for another hour, war stories mixed with complaints about military bureaucracy, which mixed with increasingly ridiculous debates about which species had worse field rations. The Xylanthians insisted human protein paste was an affront to all concepts of food. The humans countered that Xylanthian compressed nutrient blocks had the texture and taste of recycled boot leather. Lyra found herself laughing again, multiple times, at Declan's impression of a supply sergeant trying to explain why they'd been sent winter gear for a desert operation. At Lieutenant Marcellus's story about accidentally triggering every alarm on the base during what was supposed to be a stealth training exercise. At Vex's deadpan delivery of increasingly absurd regulations buried in military documentation that nobody had bothered to remove. The weight in her chest continued to loosen. Not disappearing, the loss of Kessa would never disappear. The responsibility of command would never fully lift, but it felt manageable, shared somehow, even though these soldiers hadn't been there when Kessa died, even though they carried their own losses and couldn't take hers. But they understood, and understanding was enough. She was so focused on the conversation that she almost missed the shift in the room's energy, almost missed the way tables near the entrance went quiet, almost missed the deliberate footsteps approaching. Almost. But her enhanced hearing caught it, caught the familiar rhythm of Commander Patterson's stride, caught the subvocal mutter as he activated his neurocom, caught the quiet response from someone off base. Admiral Petrov, her ears identified, giving orders. "Commander, I'm seeing reports of protocol breach with the Xylanthian royalty. Handle it now." "Understood, sir." Patterson was coming, with purpose, with authority, with the weight of military regulation behind him. Lyra could have warned Declan, could have given him time to prepare, but she chose not to, chose instead to let this play out naturally, to see what happened when the system she'd been maintaining collided with the new configuration she was building. Commander James Patterson approached their table with 2 security officers flanking him. Not aggressive, professional, but clearly official. The conversations died. 8 people looked up, varying expressions of concern crossing their faces. Declan saw the security officers first. His eyes widened slightly, then he glanced at Lyra's uniform insignia. Really looked at it for the first time. She watched recognition dawn slowly. Watched him count the markers of rank. The royal designation, the command authority. Watched him realize exactly who he had been casually chatting with for the past hour. "Oh," he said quietly. "Oh, hell." "Corporal Thorne," Patterson said, his voice carrying that particular tone of disappointed authority that officers practiced in front of mirrors. "We need to discuss this. Now." Declan stood slowly, his exhaustion suddenly visible in every line of his body. "Sir, is this about the sitting thing?" "This is about protocol, Corporal," Patterson said, his jaw tight. "Specifically the protocols regarding interaction with allied royal personnel, which you appear to have disregarded entirely." The hall went silent, not the shocked silence from earlier. This was different, anticipatory, everyone waiting to see how this would resolve. Lyra felt the familiar weight of expectation. This was the moment. The point where she was supposed to confirm Patterson's authority, acknowledge the breach, allow the system to reassert itself. This was how the wall stayed solid. Declan spoke before she could. "Sir, with all due respect, the regulation about approaching royal personnel says I need permission. I asked if I could sit. She didn't say no. That's permission by default. Or at least that's how it worked in every other social situation I've ever encountered. The regulation requires explicit permission, Corporal, Patterson said, and Lyra could hear the rehearsed quality of his response. Not assumed consent through silence. Okay, Declan said, with the reasonable tone of someone trying to logic their way out of trouble. But that seems like a really inefficient communication protocol. Does that mean every time someone wants to sit at a table, they need verbal confirmation? Because I've been sitting at tables my entire military career, and nobody's ever required me to wait for explicit permission before. That would make mess hall operations take approximately 6 times longer. This isn't about efficiency, Corporal, Patterson said, and there was genuine concern in his voice now, not just authority. This is about respect for our allies and the proper conduct expected of soldiers in the United Colonial Forces. Lyra rose from her chair. The movement was deliberate, controlled, full of the royal bearing that had been trained into her since childhood. She didn't use her full height often. It was generally unnecessary and occasionally counterproductive. But now she drew herself up to her complete posture, letting every bit of authority she'd been taught to project settle over her like armor. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Commander Patterson," she said, her voice cutting through the space with precision. Not loud, she didn't need volume when she had presence. Patterson turned to face her fully, and she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Saw him recalibrating his approach now that she'd entered the conversation directly. "I appreciate your concern for proper protocol," Lyra continued. "However, I must ask you to clarify something. Are you suggesting that I am incapable of refusing unwanted company?" Patterson's face did something complicated. "Your Highness, I'm not suggesting..." Because if Corporal Thorne had approached without permission, Lyra interrupted, her tone remaining perfectly level. "I assure you he would have been informed immediately. I am not a diplomat who requires protection from social interaction. I am a combat officer who has personally killed 47 krill in close quarters and successfully commanded 3 major operations on this moon. I believe I can manage declining an invitation to share a table." She let that hang in the air for a moment. Around the hall, she could see the Xylanthian officers sitting straighter, something like pride flickering across their faces. Her own people remembering what she was beneath the isolation they'd helped create. "Furthermore," she continued, "Corporal Thorne did precisely what protocol requires. He requested permission to occupy the space. I granted it through my silence, which is a perfectly acceptable form of consent in Xylanthian diplomatic tradition. If you'd like to argue that human protocols supersede Xylanthian ones when interacting with Xylanthian royalty, I suggest you take that up with the Joint Command Council." She paused, let her voice drop into something that carried warning beneath professional courtesy. "And prepare for an interesting conversation about colonial attitudes." Captain Vex was grinning now, not even trying to hide it. The younger officers at the table looked like they just witnessed their princess win a tactical engagement without firing a shot, which in a sense they had. Patterson opened his mouth closed. It tried again. "Your Highness, I apologize if I overstepped. I was merely trying to ensure that my dignity remained intact," Lyra said, softening her tone slightly, enough to make it clear she wasn't declaring war over this. "I appreciate the gesture, Commander, I do. But kindly do not suggest that I require your intervention to defend my own honor or enforce my own boundaries." She paused, let her shoulders relax fractionally. "Corporal Thorne and I were having a discussion about our shared combat experiences. If that conversation had been unwelcome, you would have witnessed it ending approximately 2 seconds after it began. I am quite capable of making my preferences known when necessary." Patterson executed what might have been a respectful retreat or might have been a tactical withdrawal. "Understood, Your Highness. My apologies for the interruption." To Declan, he added, "Corporal, carry on." The security officers followed him back toward the entrance, looking relieved to be leaving without incident. The hall remained quiet for another few seconds. Then someone started clapping. Slowly at first, just one person, then building. Captain Vex had risen to his feet and applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Other Xylanthian officers joined him. Then human soldiers, some looking uncertain about whether applause was appropriate protocol, but doing it anyway because the moment felt like it deserved recognition. Not mockery, not relief. Genuine respect for watching their princess stand up for her own agency in a way that most of them had never witnessed before. Lyra remained standing until the applause faded. Then she sat back down with the same controlled grace she'd brought to standing and picked up her water glass like nothing significant had happened. Declan sat back down, slowly looking dazed. His hands were shaking slightly, residual adrenaline from thinking his career was about to end over an empty chair and a good view. "So," he said, his voice pitched carefully between humor and genuine shock. "Your Highness, that's actually a thing. You're actually royalty." "Princess Lyra Thorne of the Xylanthian Third Fleet," she confirmed. "Heir apparent to the Northern Territories, commander of approximately 12,000 soldiers, and apparently someone who makes sitting at tables significantly more complicated than it needs to be." "That explains why Rico looked like he was going to have a heart attack," Declan said. He was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "I'm sorry, I should have recognized the insignia. Should have asked more formally." "Should have? You asked what was funny and sat down," Lyra interrupted. "You didn't dare to approach me. You simply didn't see a reason not to." "Well, yeah," Declan said, like this was obvious. "You had empty chairs and a good view. Seemed straightforward." "It was straightforward," Lyra said, and there was something in her voice that made him look up and meet her eyes. "No one has treated it as straightforward in a very long time." She reached for her half of the ration bar, unwrapped. It deliberately took a bite of the synthetic chocolate that barely qualified as sweet. "Thank you," she said, "for the conversation, for the dessert ration, for seeing a chair instead of a barrier." Declan's expression shifted into something warmer, the grin returning but softer now, tinged with understanding that went deeper than jokes about commanders and terrible food. "Anytime, Your Highness," he said. Then, because he apparently couldn't help himself, "Though I have to admit now that I know your royalty, the whole thing where I did an impression of Patterson seems significantly less appropriate." "It was an accurate impression," Lyra said, and found herself smiling again. "Perhaps too accurate, which makes it more entertaining." The conversation resumed, easier now somehow, despite the revelation, or maybe because of it, because the confrontation had happened and resolved, and everyone at the table had witnessed Lyra defend Declan's right to sit there, had witnessed her choose this, actively, deliberately. The walls were coming down. Not all at once, not recklessly, but definitely visibly coming down. Rico leaned across the table toward Declan and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "So you accidentally had dinner with royalty and made fun of our commanding officer. How's your evening going?" The laughter that followed was genuine and widespread, and included Lyra's voice, clear and free. Captain Vex raised his glass in silent toast. To survival, to change, to whatever this new normal might become. Lyra raised her water glass in response. The 4.7-meter radius had collapsed, and she was choosing it, one conversation at a time. Eventually, the celebration began to wind down. Soldiers drifting away to duty shifts and bunks and the thousand small tasks that filled the spaces between combat operations. The table near the viewport slowly emptied as people made their excuses and departed. Lyra remained longer than she'd intended, caught up in conversation with Vex and Declan about optimal squad configurations for mixed species operations in urban environments. The kind of tactical discussion that energized her, that reminded her why she'd chosen military service over the diplomatic track her family had initially preferred. Finally, as the mess hall approached empty, she stood. "Gentlemen, this has been valuable, but I have a briefing to prepare for tomorrow's operational planning session. I suspect you all have similar obligations." They rose, saluted, began to disperse. Declan walked with her toward the exit, not presuming, not avoiding, just companionable proximity. "So," he said as they reached the corridor junction where their paths would diverge, "next week there's supposedly another celebration. Something about the engineering corps finishing repairs ahead of schedule. Will you be there?" Lyra considered. Thought about her schedule, her obligations, the dozen other things that could claim her time. Thought about the choice she'd just made, the walls she'd just started dismantling. "Yes," she said, "I'll be there." "Will you save me a seat?" Declan asked. Then with a grin, "Or should I just show up and hope for the best again?" Lyra allowed herself a small smile. "Next time, Corporal Thorne, you have explicit permission, in advance. Consider this your standing invitation to join me at that table whenever we both happen to be present. Declan's grin widened. Understood, Your Highness. I'll try not to make you defend my right to sit there every single time. Once was sufficient, Lyra agreed. I trust the message has been received by those who needed to hear it. They reached the junction. Declan's quarters were 3 levels down in the enlisted section. Lyra's were in the command wing, isolated by design for security and privacy. Good night, Commander, Declan said, offering a salute that was crisp despite the informal context. Lyra returned it. Good night, Corporal, and thank you for tonight, for all of it. Thank you, ma'am, Declan said, for not having me court-martialed, and for the conversation. Both were appreciated. He turned and headed down the corridor, and Lyra watched him go for just a moment before continuing to her own quarters. The walk was familiar. She'd made this journey hundreds of times, but tonight it felt different. Lighter somehow, like something heavy she'd been carrying had finally been set down. In her quarters, she found herself looking at the protein bar wrapper. She'd saved it, though she couldn't have fully articulated why. Evidence, maybe. Proof that the moment had been real and not some exhaustion-induced hallucination. She set it on her desk next to the tactical display showing current krill movement patterns. The juxtaposition felt appropriate. War and connection, duty and humanity. The balance she was learning to maintain instead of sacrificing one for the other. Her neural implant pulsed with incoming messages, reports, requests, the endless administrative burden that never stopped. She processed them efficiently, but part of her attention remained on that wrapper, on Kessa's last words. Stop hiding behind your crown, on the feel of walls coming down, on the understanding that isolation had never been inevitable. It had been a choice she'd made unconsciously, and choices could be unmade. One table, one conversation, one moment of genuine connection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she'd chosen differently. And that was enough. 1 week passed in the rhythm of military operations, briefings, training exercises, tactical planning for the next deployment, the machinery of war that never stopped even in moments of celebration. Lyra tested the new configuration she'd created. Small changes, deliberate adjustments to see what held and what crumbled. She walked through the common areas without the security detail that usually accompanied royal personnel. No one died. Several soldiers nodded respectful greetings. A few even smiled. She took meals in the mess hall during normal hours, instead of the private dining facility reserved for command staff. The 4.7-meter radius did not reassert itself. People maintained respectful distance, but it was the distance of military courtesy now, not fear. She allowed junior officers to ask questions during briefings without requiring them to submit queries through formal channels first. The questions were intelligent, tactical, exactly the kind of input that made operations run more smoothly. But there were moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. When a lieutenant started to call her Your Highness in a tactical meeting, and she had to consciously choose whether to correct him to Commander or let it pass. When she caught herself about to issue a formal challenge over a perceived slight, then forced herself to pause and consider whether protocol truly served purpose or simply habit. Change was harder than she'd expected. Not the decision to change. That had been made at a table with empty chairs and a soldier who laughed at inappropriate times. But the daily work of maintaining that change, of choosing differently 100 small times instead of one large time. Captain Vex helped whether he knew it or not. He'd started approaching her directly with tactical questions instead of routing them through proper channels. The first time she'd almost corrected him, almost reminded him of the hierarchy that was supposed to govern their interactions. But she'd stopped herself, answered his question, discovered that direct communication was significantly more efficient than formal protocols. The second time, it was easier. The third time, natural. Small changes, building on each other. Forward Operating Base Arcturus scheduled another celebration, smaller than the victory party, more formal. A promotion ceremony for soldiers who'd distinguished themselves during the recent operations. Medals would be awarded, ranks officially elevated. Lyra arrived exactly on time, not early. That felt like a statement she wanted to make. That she was part of this community, not observing it from careful distance. The mess hall had been reconfigured, tables pushed aside to create formation space. A raised platform at one end where Admiral Petrov would preside via holographic projection. And there near the viewport where stars were visible through reinforced glass, one table remained. 6 chairs, exactly where it had been a week ago. Someone had left it there, despite the reconfiguration. Someone had decided that table meant something worth preserving. Lyra moved through the crowd, acknowledging salutes with practiced efficiency. But her attention kept returning to that table. The ceremony began on schedule. Admiral Petrov's hologram materialized life-sized and convincing, except for slight transparency. "Soldiers of the United Colonial Forces," he began. "We gather to honor those who exemplified courage, tactical excellence, and unwavering commitment during recent operations against Krill forces on Vardo 7. The speech followed predictable patterns. Lyra stood in the front row with other senior officers, posture perfect attention, apparently focused forward. But her peripheral vision tracked the entrance. Waiting. Captain Vex received a commendation for tactical leadership during the Sector 12 siege. He accepted with quiet dignity, and when his eyes found Lyra's for just a moment, something passed between them. Recognition, the beginning of mutual respect instead of rigid hierarchy. Lieutenant Marcellus got promoted for defensive strategies that had saved his squad. The young man looked simultaneously proud and uncomfortable with attention. And then Petrov called the name she'd been waiting for. Corporal Declan Thorne, front and center. Declan emerged from the formation looking marginally more put together than a week ago. The tactical vest was gone. The regeneration patch on his jaw had been replaced by fresh pink skin. He'd found a dress uniform that almost fit. He walked to the platform with loose-limbed stride, but his salute was crisp when he reached Petrov's hologram. "Corporal Thorne," Petrov said, "for exceptional courage during the Sector 7 operation, particularly during the tunnel collapse incident, where you led extraction efforts that saved your entire squad, and for demonstrating leadership that transcends rank in moments of crisis, you are hereby promoted to Sergeant and awarded the Colonial Star of Valor." Declan's eyes widened. The Colonial Star wasn't handed out casually. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I was just doing what needed doing, but I'll accept this on behalf of my squad, who all contributed to getting us out alive." Humble without being falsely modest. Acknowledging team while accepting personal recognition. Lyra found herself nodding approval. The medal was pinned, the rank insignia applied. Declan saluted, turned to return to formation. As he passed Lyra's position, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Acknowledgement, appreciation, recognition that they'd both survived hell and were both figuring out what came after. The ceremony continued. More names, more medals, more promotions earned through blood and tactical brilliance. Finally, Petrov concluded, "You have all served with distinction. You've honored your oaths and protected those who cannot protect themselves. Take pride in what you've accomplished, but remain vigilant. The Krill are beaten here, but not eliminated. There will be more deployments, more operations." He paused, holographic eyes seeming to scan the assembled soldiers. "For now, though, celebrate. You've earned it. Dismissed." The formation broke apart. Soldiers relaxing into conversation, congratulating each other, examining medals and new rank insignia. The hall's configuration shifted as personnel moved tables back, transforming ceremonial space back into something social. Lyra watched Declan get swarmed by his squad, Rico leading the charge with enthusiasm that bordered on aggressive celebration. They were all talking at once, making jokes about Sergeant Butterfingers or whatever ridiculous nicknames soldiers invented. She could join that celebration, but it felt like it would be inserting herself into something that belonged to them. Instead, she turned toward the table by the viewport. She sat down in the chair she'd occupied before. Back to the glass. Sightlines maintained, tactical position by habit even when tactics weren't required. And she waited. Conversation flowed around her naturally now. Soldiers passed by without the careful distance of before. A few nodded respectful greetings. A young Zalanthian private paused, barely out of basic training by the look of him. "Excuse me, Commander, is this seat taken?" Lyra looked at the young soldier and made a choice. "Not at the moment, Private. You're welcome to it if you'd like." The private's eyes widened. He glanced at his companions who were watching with shocked encouragement. Then he sat down carefully. "Thank you, Commander. I'm Private Tavin. First deployment. I wanted to say that your tactical briefing on urban krill combat was really helpful. I used the techniques you outlined during a skirmish last week. Lyra studied him, young, nervous, but genuine. I'm glad the briefing proved useful, Private, she said. Urban combat with krill requires different approaches than open terrain. Did you find the section on vertical maneuvering sufficient, or would you suggest additions based on your experience? Tavin blinked, surprised to be asked his opinion. Actually, Commander, I think more emphasis on sound discipline would help. The krill in urban environments seem to track movement by audio more than visual. We had better success when we minimize noise. An excellent observation, Lyra said, meaning it. I'll incorporate that into the next briefing revision. Thank you for the feedback. Before Tavin could respond, Declan appeared at the table. 2 trays balanced in his hands, Rico trailing behind with a third. This seat saved, Declan asked, gesturing to the chair across from Lyra with the new sergeant's insignia visible on his collar. She looked up at him, at the colonial star pinned to his chest, at the expression that was equal parts confident and uncertain. For you, Sergeant Thorne, always. He grinned and sat down. Rico took the chair beside him. The table began filling. Captain Vex appeared with other Zalanthian officers. Human soldiers pulled up additional chairs from nearby tables. 12 people clustered around the original 6-chair table in comfortable chaos. And then Admiral Petrov's hologram materialized directly beside their table. Not on the platform, right there. Close enough that his projection seemed to occupy the space like a physical presence. The conversations died instantly. 12 soldiers straightening in their chairs, suddenly aware that the highest-ranking officer in the system was standing at their table. Lyra felt tension spike through the group, felt old patterns trying to reassert themselves. The instinct to defer to create distance, to acknowledge hierarchy through physical separation. She remained seated, deliberately, choosing to model something different. Admiral Petrov, she said, her tone respectful but not deferential. Is there something I can help you with? Petrov's holographic eyes scanned the table, taking in the mixed ranks, the casual integration of human and Zalanthian, the way Princess Lyra Thorne sat among them like she belonged there rather than above them. Commander Thorne, he said, and his tone was carefully neutral, I've been receiving reports about changes in protocol regarding interactions with royal personnel, changes that weren't submitted through proper channels for approval. Lyra felt the weight of every eye at the table, felt Declan tense beside her, felt Captain Vex preparing to defend her if necessary. But this was her choice, her responsibility. With respect, Admiral, she said, voice level and clear. I was not aware that I required approval to clarify how soldiers may interact with me personally. The protocols in question govern approach to Zalanthian royalty. As the royal in question, I believe I have authority to interpret those protocols as they apply to my own person. You have authority to interpret, Petrov agreed, but not to fundamentally alter regulations that govern Alliance military conduct. I haven't altered the regulations, sir, Lyra said. I've clarified my personal boundaries within the framework those regulations provide. The protocols state that soldiers must request permission to approach royal personnel. They do not specify the form that permission must take. I've simply made explicit that I accept multiple forms of consent, including implied consent, through context. You're arguing semantics, Commander. I'm arguing clarity, Admiral. With respect, the protocols were designed to protect royalty from unwanted interaction. They were not designed to isolate royalty from all interaction. The distinction matters. Petrov was quiet for a moment. His hologram flickered slightly, signal lag from wherever his physical body was stationed. You're undermining military hierarchy, he said finally. No, sir, Lyra said, and there was steel beneath the respectful tone now. I'm demonstrating that hierarchy can coexist with accessibility. That command authority doesn't require physical isolation. That respect can be maintained without fear. She gestured to the table. Every soldier here knows my rank, knows my position, addresses me appropriately in professional contexts. But in this moment during celebration, they also know they can approach me with tactical observations, questions, or simple conversation. That makes them better soldiers, not worse ones. It makes them comfortable, Petrov said. Comfort breeds complacency. Comfort breeds trust, Lyra countered, and trust makes soldiers follow orders even when those orders might get them killed. I would rather command through earned respect than enforced fear, Admiral. The former is more reliable when circumstances become difficult. The table was absolutely silent, watching their princess argue with the highest authority in the system, watching her defend not just her own choices, but their right to be part of those choices. Petrov's expression was unreadable. And if other royal personnel object to your interpretation, if they argue that you're setting precedent that undermines their own security, then they can enforce different boundaries for their own persons, Lyra said. These protocols apply to how soldiers interact with me, not with other royalty. Each royal has authority to set their own standards. Another pause, longer this time. Then Petrov did something unexpected. He smiled, slight but genuine. Well argued, Commander, he said. You've clearly thought this through. I have, sir. And you're prepared to defend this position if it becomes controversial. I am, sir, though I would prefer it didn't become controversial. I'd prefer it simply became normal. Petrov nodded slowly. Very well. I'll note in my report that you've clarified protocols regarding your personal interactions within the bounds of your authority. But Commander, Sir, if this experiment fails, if it compromises your security or effectiveness, you'll reinstate previous protocols immediately. Understood, Admiral, though I don't believe it will fail. Why not? Lyra looked around the table. At Declan, who'd accidentally started all of this by being too exhausted to see barriers. At Vex, who'd served under her command and earned the right to sit beside her now. At Private Tavin, who'd offered tactical feedback without fear. At the others, human and Zelanthian, who'd chosen to join them. Because these soldiers don't want special treatment, sir. They want to be effective, and sometimes effectiveness requires direct communication more than formal protocols. They understand that. So do I. Petrov studied her for a long moment. Then his hologram flickered in what might have been a nod. Carry on, Commander, and congratulations to all promotion recipients. His projection vanished. The table remained silent for approximately 3 seconds. Then Declan let out a long breath. Well, that was terrifying. That was impressive, Vex corrected. Commander, I've never seen anyone argue with Admiral Petrov and win. I didn't win, Lyra said. I clarified. There's a difference. You defended our right to sit here, Private Tavin said quietly. That matters, ma'am. Lyra looked at the young soldier, saw genuine gratitude in his expression, saw understanding that this was about more than just table seating, about whether the future of the Alliance military would be built on fear and distance or trust and integration. Yes, she said simply, it does matter. The conversation resumed, easier now somehow. The confrontation had happened and resolved, and everyone at the table had witnessed Lyra defend not just her own authority, but their inclusion in her space. Commander Patterson approached midway through the meal. No security detail this time, just him carrying a tray. Commander Thorne, he said, addressing Lyra by military rank. Permission to join you. Lyra gestured to an empty chair that had been pulled up. Granted, Commander, please. Patterson sat, and if anyone found it strange that 2 commanding officers were sharing a meal with enlisted personnel and junior officers, they kept it to themselves. Congratulations on your promotion, Sergeant, Patterson said to Declan. Well deserved. Thank you, sir, Declan said. I promise to cause fewer heart palpitations going forward. I'll believe it when I see it, Patterson said, but he was smiling. Though I'll admit your approach to protocol has been educational. Is that a nice way of saying we broke rules and got away with it? It's a nice way of saying you revealed that some rules needed examination, Patterson said. He glanced at Lyra. Your Highness Commander, I owe you an apology from last week. I was trying to protect regulations without considering whether those regulations actually served their intended purpose. You were doing your job, Commander, Lyra said, ensuring proper conduct. I appreciate the intent, even if I disagree with the application. Noted and adjusted. Patterson took a bite of his food, grimaced. Is it just me, or does the food get worse every week? It's definitely worse, Declan confirmed. I think the synthesizers are slowly dying and nobody wants to admit it. The conversation shifted to complaints about food quality, which shifted to stories about the worst meals anyone had eaten during deployment, which shifted to increasingly ridiculous debates about military logistics. Lyra participated, laughed, let herself be part of it. Eventually, soldiers began drifting away. Duty shifts, reports, sleep. The table emptied slowly until only Lyra and Declan remained. So, Declan said, standing and collecting the trays. Same time next week. There's a briefing next week, Lyra said. Sector 15 deployment orders. We ship out in 72 hours. Declan's grin faltered slightly. Sector 15, that's the urban combat zone. Yes. Could be worse than Sector 7. Could be worse than Sector 12, Lyra agreed, which is why I want soldiers who understand that survival requires adaptability, not just protocol. Declan studied her face. You're worried. Not a question. I'm a commander sending soldiers into combat, Lyra said. Worry is part of the job. That's not what I meant. She held his gaze. He was right. She was worried. Not about tactics. She'd planned hundreds of operations. But about this new configuration. About whether she'd weaken something by changing it. There's a final briefing tonight, Lyra said instead of answering. 2000 hours. Don't be late. Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am. She turned to leave, then paused. Sergeant, after the briefing, if you're not too tired. Yeah. Same table. Declan's grin returned. Same table, Commander. I'll bring the terrible synthesizer food. I'll bring the protein bars. That night, after the briefing concluded and tactical plans were reviewed and deployment orders finalized, Lyra sat at the table by the viewport. Declan across from her, Vex and Rico and Private Tavin and others filling surrounding chairs. Tomorrow they'd return to war, to darkness and violence, and the constant possibility of death. But tonight they shared terrible food and worse jokes and the simple comfort of not being alone. Through the viewport, stars burned cold and distant against the void. But inside, surrounded by soldiers who'd chosen to sit beside her, Lyra felt warm. The following week brought Sector 15 deployment orders, mixed human-Zelanthian task force, Lyra's command, departure in 72 hours. She found Declan in the training facility running combat drills with his newly assigned squad. He moved with more confidence now. The sergeant's insignia apparently granting him permission to own his natural leadership instead of deflecting it with jokes, though he still made plenty of jokes. Some things didn't change. Sergeant Thorne, she called across the training floor. A moment. He jogged over, slightly out of breath, grinning. Commander, come to make sure I'm not teaching them bad habits. I came to inform you that you're assigned to my task force for Sector 15. We deploy in 3 days. His grin faltered. Urban combat zone, heavy krill presence. Yes. Could be worse than Sector 7. Could be worse than Sector 12, Lyra said, which is why I want soldiers who understand that survival requires adaptability. Declan studied her face, reading something there. You're still worried. I'm a commander sending soldiers into combat, Lyra said. Worry doesn't stop being part of the job just because I've changed how I interact with those soldiers. That's not what you're worried about. She held his gaze. He was right. She was worried about whether she'd made the right choice, whether Kessa would approve of what she'd become or think she'd overcorrected, whether walls existed for reasons that went beyond fear. There's a final briefing tonight, Lyra said. 2000 hours. I'll be there. She turned to leave, then paused. Sergeant, after the briefing. Same table, same table. That night, after briefings and preparations and all the machinery of war had ground through its necessary cycles, Lyra sat at the table by the viewport one last time before deployment. The hall was quieter now. Most soldiers were in their quarters preparing gear, writing letters home, doing the 1,000 small rituals that preceded deployment into combat zones. But a few remained, gathered around this table. This place they'd claimed together. Declan across from her, Vex to her left, Rico and Private Tavin and others filling the spaces between. Tomorrow we go back to war, Vex said quietly, to darkness and krill and all the rest. Tomorrow we do our jobs, Lyra corrected, the same jobs we've always done. We just do them with better understanding of who we're fighting beside. Is that what this was about? Private Tavin asked. The table, the conversations, all of it, understanding. Lyra considered the question. Thought about Kessa's last words, about 7 duels and 10 months of isolation, about a soldier who'd laughed in a doorway and sat down without seeing barriers. No, she said finally. It was about choosing to stop hiding behind protocols that protected me from connection while pretending to protect me from danger. Understanding was a consequence, not the goal. What was the goal? Declan asked. Lyra looked around the table. At soldiers who'd been strangers a week ago, who'd become something more through shared stories and terrible food and the simple act of sitting together. Not being alone, she said simply. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Rico raised his water glass. To not being alone. They all raised their glasses, touched them together in a gesture that was part military tradition, part simple human need for ritual in the face of uncertainty. To not being alone, they echoed. Through the viewport, Vardo 7's scarred surface rotated slowly beneath them. Tomorrow they'd descend to another moon, another tunnel system, another battle against an enemy that didn't care about protocols or rank or the careful walls people built to protect themselves from loss. But tonight they had this table, this moment, this choice to face what came next together instead of alone. Lyra looked at the protein bar wrapper she'd brought with her, the one Declan had given her that first night. She'd been carrying it as a reminder, but she realized she didn't need reminders anymore. She'd internalized the lesson, made it part of herself. She set the wrapper on the table. Does anyone want this? Declan picked it up, examined it. You kept the wrapper from that terrible ration bar. I did, Lyra admitted, as evidence that change was possible. But I don't need evidence anymore. What do you need? Need. Lyra looked around the table at faces she'd learned, at soldiers she'd come to trust, at the foundation of something new built on the ruins of something old. This, she said, exactly this. The conversation continued for another hour. Eventually, people drifted away to their quarters, their preparations, their private rituals. Lyra remained at the table longest, not because she was avoiding her quarters, but because she was memorizing this. The view of the stars, the comfortable chairs, the feeling of warmth that had replaced the cold isolation she'd maintained for so long. Tomorrow would bring challenges. War didn't care about personal growth or social experiments. The Krill would attack with the same mindless aggression, regardless of whether she'd changed protocols or maintained walls. But she would face those challenges surrounded by soldiers who knew her not just as a commander or a princess, but as a person who'd chosen to stop hiding, who'd chosen to be seen, who'd chosen to believe that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites, but partners in the work of becoming someone worth following into the dark. The Ice Princess had thawed, and what emerged was ready for whatever came next. She stood, walked to her quarters, prepared her gear for deployment with the same methodical precision she'd always brought to military operations. But as she checked her equipment one final time, she found herself smiling. Because tomorrow when they descended into Sector 15's urban combat zones, she wouldn't be going alone. She'd be going with soldiers who'd chosen to sit beside her when they didn't have to, who'd seen past protocols to the person beneath, who'd reminded her that isolation was a choice, not a sentence. And that made all the difference. The protein bar wrapper stayed on the table in the mess hall, a small piece of debris that cleaning crews would dispose of in the morning. But the lesson it represented remained, written not on synthetic packaging, but in the new patterns of interaction spreading through forward operating base Arcturus, in junior officers asking questions without fear, in enlisted personnel offering tactical observations directly to commanders, in the slow dissolution of barriers that had never actually protected anyone from anything that mattered. Change Lyra realized wasn't one dramatic moment. It was 1,000 small choices made consistently over time. It was choosing to answer honestly instead of deflecting, choosing to sit among instead of above, choosing to be known instead of merely respected. It was hard work, harder than maintaining walls, because walls protected you from pain, but they also isolated you from everything that made pain bearable. Connection, understanding, the knowledge that you weren't facing the darkness alone. Tomorrow would test whether her choices had been wise, whether the new configuration she'd built was strong enough to withstand combat's brutal reality. But tonight she'd made those choices, and she wouldn't unmake them even if she could, because Kessa had been right. They needed to see her bleed, and she needed to see them as more than soldiers under her command. She needed to see them as people worth sitting beside, worth fighting beside, worth surviving beside. The ice had thawed, and what remained was strong enough.